Great. So it's a little strange talking to myself, but I want to welcome everybody who chose to come on board this evening to learn a little bit more about what's going on for all of us. This is truly a remarkable time, and it's remarkable for absolutely everyone. As physicians, I can tell you there's a lot of conversation we're having with one another, trying to figure out how to best approach what's going on. As a mom, as a wife, as a neighbor, as a daughter, and I know it's true for everybody else who is listening. So I hope to clear up some perhaps confusion, maybe validate some things that you're thinking already, and then offer you some really practical things that will help you manage what's going on now. So let's get started.
Dr. Koffler, I just want to make sure that the participants know that if you have a question, please feel free to use the question tab down below your page and ask it. We will try our best to answer as many questions as possible during the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, guys, so I just want you all to appreciate what we're talking about when it comes to infections is a remarkably complex system in the body, the immune system, which we divide it into two basic categories, the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. But really the immune system starts at all the barriers, and you're familiar with many of the barriers, the skin being one of our best barriers, but also the mucous membrane. So that's your nose, your sinuses, your throat, down into your lungs. It's also the lining of your entire GI tract and so forth. So those linings are incredibly sophisticated and have a very robust way of identifying foreign invaders and trying to contain them at that level. And you know this well because if you've ever had a sore throat, you know that you get pain in the area that the infection is residing in. That's due to the inflammation, which is working hard to contain it. And you may get a swollen gland that you can see at the back of your throat. If it's strep throat, you may even see pockets of pus produced by the bacteria. You may get a lymph node that swells as the immune systems are working hard to contain it so that it doesn't get any further. So realize too, this amazing system that we have, we build 1 million white blood cells every 10 seconds, which is pretty astonishing. Now, when we first get infected in the first few days after exposure, it's really our innate immune system that dominates. And that's these cells you see in the pink on the left-hand side of your screen. And that includes things like macrophages, which convert into natural killer cells, and neutrophils, which dominate particularly in bacterial infections, dendritic cells that actually take bites off of the invading organism and present them to other cells to say, see, this is what the problem is, and so forth. Eosinophils, which tend to dominate with parasites or with allergic reactions or with things like, well, those are the two biggest ones when it comes to eosinophils. And then we have later on the adaptive immune system. So the innate immune system just attacks everything that shouldn't be there. The adaptive immune system takes information from the natural killer cells, the NK cells listed in the middle, and become very specific for that invasion, for that organism that's invading. And by doing so, it converts itself into cells that will later inflammation and cells that will be calling out the troops to come in and help at the site of the infection. In addition, we make B cells that will then produce antibodies that we're all very familiar with. So they're not two distinct systems in that one's operating independently of the other. They're talking to each other a lot. Recognize that the innate immune system is dominant when we first get infected. So we want to make sure that's really responsive and robust. Okay, so when we're looking at who is getting infected, we've seen these graphs, many of us, showing that it's mainly the elderly that are considered to be more susceptible. But in fact, that's no longer completely clear, especially in the United States where we're seeing younger people. What is true, however, is that as we age, we tend to accumulate more of what we call comorbid conditions. Conditions like high blood pressure, which was seen as particularly problematic in China, as well as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, pulmonary diseases, cancer to some extent. I don't believe we've seen as much of that in this country. And you could see how the rates on the left-hand side go from quite low in the younger ages to over 80, where the mortality rate approaches 15%. It tells us that the healthier we can remain as we age, the more robust our immune systems will be, and the less likely we'll have these diseases as a cause of why we succumb. What's very interesting is that we find that healthy pregnant women are not at increased risk, nor is there any evidence of transmission intrauterine to the baby. And we have not detected virus in the breast milk, which is very encouraging. So realize that age in and of itself does not mean we're going to have a poorer immune system. If we have been living with chronic low-grade inflammation, however, we outpace our ability to generate the youthful cells that I mentioned before. And that conditions like diabetes and so forth take a toll because of the damage that they create in the body. They take a toll on our healthy white blood cells. So our goal is to limit injury by limiting inflammation. And that's really the cornerstone of a lot of the treatments that we use to prevent. So just an FYI, the coronavirus name COVID-19 is the infection. It comes from coronavirus plus detected in the year 2019. We call it COVID-19. And what you're seeing in those maroon or reddish spikes on the surface of the virus is the corona or crown-like look to the virus. And in fact, those spikes are very interesting because it is through those spikes that the virus actually gains entry into our cells. Now, the gray coating, which really should be bright yellow because it's made out of a lipid or a fatty membrane. And that's one of the vulnerabilities of the virus. This is why washing our hands is so incredibly effective in eradicating the virus. And we say hot water, it doesn't absolutely have to be hot water, although we suspect that the heat helps, but certainly soap. And everybody at this point knows that 20 seconds worth of hand washing is effective. All detergents break up lipids, and we know that because those of us who cook and use healthy oils to cook will get our pans restored to new when we use detergent to clean it. So that's one of its vulnerabilities. Now, when we talk about spread, because this is of great interest now, we do know that droplets remain airborne for about 3 to 4 hours. but that they don't remain infective. So while they may be present, while you may be able to detect the RNA of the virus, their ability to infect is declining. Within 60 minutes, the droplets have lost their potency. We also know that it's shed in stool, and that a quarter of people studied thus far have a persistence of viral particles in their stool for up to 30 days, even after their nasal and throat swabs have become negative. So that's something for us to focus on, for us to be aware of. And that's one big reason why we always want to wash our hands after using the restroom. We don't know that foodborne or waterborne infection is happening. We consider it to be possible, but it hasn't yet been clearly demonstrated. We also know, of course, everybody's been following the information that it remains viable on surfaces for several days, but we haven't also been clearly able to show that by touching contaminated surfaces, we're spreading the infection. However, that doesn't mean that we want people to be prudent, and of course, wiping down those surfaces that could have been exposed is just good common sense. Now, the question has been, should you wear masks? I think now, when I first made this slide, that was the big debate, despite the fact that President Trump has declined to wear a mask. We feel now that it is a good idea to limit possible exposure. It does not need to be an N95 mask. For anybody who's worn those, they're incredibly uncomfortable, not easy to breathe through. Surgical masks or some of the fantastic homemade masks we've been seeing seem to be working well. So let's talk a little bit about how illness evolves. The incubation period, we think, is somewhere between 2 and 14 days and averages about 5 days. It's why when people have been quarantined, they've been quarantined for 2 weeks. Now, the flu has quite a predictable course for most people. It usually comes on suddenly, people feel awful. With the coronavirus, it's far more gradual. Symptoms are far more gradual and far more diverse. Initially, we were really focused on fever, cough, shortness of breath. Achiness, yes. Fatigue, yes. Maybe a stuffy nose. But what we're learning as time is going on, that GI symptoms, including abdominal pain and diarrhea and nausea, are very possibly the first signs of coronavirus. Loss of smell and taste do frequently occur. In a conversation that we had with our urgent care doctors at the University of Miami, they were surprised to see how frequently people were complaining of loss of sense of smell and taste. So that's something to be very aware of. I would say, as physicians, basically, we're beginning to think that any acute illness we see is COVID-19 until proven otherwise. This is a conversation I just had with our faculty yesterday. Now, typical symptoms initially last about 5 days, and the overwhelming majority of us will recover after those several days. For some people, it's 7 days. The interesting thing is there can be waxing and waning symptoms during that time. Now, in a much smaller percentage of us, we may go on to phase 2 and more significant symptoms can develop. One of the challenges we face as physicians is typically when we see infections, if it's going to get worse, it's getting progressively worse. But if it's getting better, we recognize there's a moment where the patient turned the corner and we can reassure them. As I said earlier, the challenge with COVID is it's not behaving the same way in every patient, and there can be waxing and waning symptoms. So for me, I'm much more vigilant about the patients that I have seen that I'm concerned about COVID than other patients that I've seen with other infectious illnesses. And this will figure into my recommendations towards the end. Now, why is it that some people are getting sicker? What's going on that, it's been very difficult for us to try to get a handle on why someone gets sicker than someone else. And what we think is that if people have an underlying inflammatory condition to begin with, they may have low reserve. They also may not have quite the inflammatory reaction, which leads to the more serious complications, but overall their reserve may be lower. If they have an underlying lung disease, an infection of the lung obviously may prove to be too much for them to handle. We think viral load plays a role. So for instance, our first responders who are repeatedly exposed to virus have tended to get sicker, particularly in this country. But we also feel that genetics plays a role. And we're beginning to identify what genetic predispositions might make somebody more susceptible to this particular virus. This is very early information, and we're just studying it now. So I want you to have just a general understanding. This is a complicated slide. You don't need to really focus on much of the wording here, but I do want you to appreciate this is what lung tissue looks like. So imagine lungs typically look like sponges. If you were to cut a sponge on end and look at it carefully, you are looking at one of the holes that you see, and lining the lung is our cells that produce surfactant, which keeps the space open. And then blood vessels that surround, you can see where it says capillary blood vessels, lie very close to the edges of the lung tissue itself. Now, the lung is very, very delicate tissue. It's only one cell layer thick, and there's interspersed immune cells throughout. When there's an infection, it activates the immune system. Remember, the innate immune system gets activated, which includes the macrophages, the neutrophils, the natural killer cells, which then activate the T cells, which call over through cytokines, help essentially to come and fight the infection. And so you can see on the right-hand side of your image, the cytokine storm that can then lead to more serious complications. The fibroblast, which is the scar tissue that gets placed down as the tissue is healing. And this is where we're concerned that people are left with a low residual lung function once the infection is cleared, once they're out of the hospital. So this just gives you a general understanding of what happens at the level of lung tissue. Now, focusing in on the virus a little bit, on the left-hand side, this is what it looks like. It's actually a very simple, remarkably simple little particle that does an incredible amount of damage potentially. So you can see these spike proteins shown on the surface, which is where in the next image you can see it attaches to a particular receptor that we call the ACE2 receptor. And you can see the orange coil on the inside is the RNA. And once the virus particle attaches to the ACE receptor, it gets brought inside the cell, and through a series of reactions, any one of which are potentially sites of interruption. In other words, they're potentially sites of either herbs, botanicals, supplements, or pharmaceuticals to interrupt the downstream events. what will happen is that RNA, or that orange coil, gets let out of that particle, and it hijacks or uses our own equipment to make more of these little tiny particles that then get released, these additional viruses that you can see being dropped at the bottom of the slide. So the challenge with COVID is that there are many more of those little spikes on the surface, up to 20 times more than what we saw with SARS. So it's really adept at trying to get into cells. But also realize that antibodies are being developed now to target those little proteins. So that's some of the scientific advances that are happening today. Just a word about chloroquine, because that is so much in the news today. One of the many ways, chloroquine actually works in a few ways. It's an anti-inflammatory in and of itself, but one of the ways it prevents infection or propagation of infection of the virus is it breaks apart those little green protein structures, which prevents the viral particle from allowing its RNA to be replicated or reproduced. So that's one of the reasons why chloroquine is of such interest. And I'm sure there's going to be questions around that. So as a community, we all know now the phrase flatten the curve. Hopefully we're all living by it. A couple of the things, really the two approaches that we can do is obviously support our healthcare capacity by not overwhelming the healthcare system, and flattening the curve by really maintaining the social distancing that we've been doing. And that really significantly limits the spread. And we know this because if we look at countries where it's been successful, particularly South Korea and Germany, and potentially even more so Finland, just looking carefully at South Korea, which has been very forthcoming in sharing many of their statistics, immediately their first case on, I believe, January 19th matched our first case on January 19th. They, however, immediately began doing testing on everyone. So they practiced immediate testing. They quarantined people immediately for 2 weeks. So they built facilities and used facilities where they quarantined patients or people very aggressively, whether or not they were symptomatic. And they were doing on the neighborhood of 15,000 tests a day, which was 1 out of every 162 people. As of now, we are testing about 1 out of every 2,000 people. So significantly less than what they were able to accomplish in South Korea. And as a result, we're seeing they've seen their new cases decline as ours continue to rise. Some of the other approaches, we talked about lockdown and ideally mass testing. Unfortunately, we are still very behind. It's as frustrating for patients as it is for physicians to not have adequate test kits, to not have adequate testing sites. We're at a loss as to why we have not been able to move that more aggressively. I think that's enough said there. And just one further word, because we know that social isolation is extremely difficult. I'm in the house with 2 teenage kids, one of whom is a senior in high school and not able to enjoy any of his senior class activities. The other is a freshman in college who is ecstatic to be finally set free, who finds herself right back in her old bedroom having to listen to some of our rules and regulations. So social isolation is extremely difficult for people from every walk of life. There have been a few folks who have done okay with it, but the overwhelming majority of people that I've spoken with, have been struggling to some degree. But we know that it works because the thing is if the virus does not have new people to infect, it will die off. It cannot survive. So if we can contain it, and if we can minimize our degree of infection with it, in other words, the degree of illness that any one of us experience, the infection will die out, the virus will die out. I don't know what's to come down the road, but we do know that in the initial bout, it will die out. So what we can do, since we think most of us will be exposed by the year's end, the most valuable thing we can all be focused on right now is optimizing our health. In my mind, you're either busy right now getting healthier, or you're busy right now getting sicker. And I can't emphasize that enough. If there was ever a time for you to feel motivated to develop healthy habits, this is it. If you ever were at a moment where you wanted to kick the sugar habit, this is it. So let's start looking at some of these habits. Any of you all who have heard me speak, I have talked plenty about sleep. I just want to say a couple of things about sleep. And it has a lot to do with melatonin. So we know that melatonin is released while we are asleep. We think one of the reasons why this virus might be affecting the elderly more is that melatonin production is significantly lower in the elderly compared to newborns and children. So one of the key things that I do want people doing right now is taking melatonin and augmenting your own natural melatonin production. And that will help your sleep. So how do we augment our own natural melatonin production? First thing, get 20 minutes of early morning sun. The early morning sun, if the pineal gland gets sun exposure first thing in the morning, and we are so blessed down here to have that, it sets up production for the remainder of the day. We produce the majority of our melatonin during the day. We secrete it or release it at night. Okay, there are absolutely no excuses, even if you're homebound, to not exercise. We've got to get creative with this. Recognize every single step you take counts. So if one of my patients who's walking up and down the hallway wearing her mask of her condo building, that all counts. Yoga, Tai Chi, there are plenty of classes online, there are apps, there's Facebook classes, there's YouTube videos, the list goes on and on and on. Minimum of 30 minutes of exercise a day, ideally 45 to an hour. It can be broken up. And realize this, I have long asked my patients to, before they get a vaccine, to exercise. So on the morning that they're going to get a vaccine, I like for them to exercise. And what we see in people who do that is they have a much stronger response to the vaccine. So if we can harness the power of exercise every single day by boosting all of those natural killer cells, those macrophages, et cetera, they are far more aggressive in their reactivity to foreign invaders, as well as more robust antibody production if we exercise. Okay, I see someone has raised their hand, but unfortunately, oh, there we go. I think I can get to it. Okay, all right. Feel free, if you all have questions, to enter it into the chat. If you click on chat, you should be able to enter your questions. Oh, people are raising their hands. I'm going to leave that up to Andrew. Okay. Let's talk about nutrition. I'm sorry I can't get to your questions. I'm going to leave that up to Andrew. Please remember that. There we go. How are we doing? Mike raised his hand. Okay.
You can continue for now, Dr. Koffler.
Okay.
I am just trying to group all the questions and I'll send them to you now.
Perfect. I'll keep going then. Sorry about the interruption. Okay, folks. So what do we want to include now in particular? So some of the things we want to make sure are in our diet, even as it's hard to get to the grocery store. You want to make sure you're eating fermented foods. So sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, yogurt, kefir, any kind of fermented food. And this may even be a time for you to learn how to make your own fermented foods. So that's really key. Why? Super rich in probiotics. Probiotics augment our own microbiome health, which lowers an inflammatory response throughout the body and sets up proper communication throughout the immune system. We also want plenty of brightly colored fruits and vegetables because they're super rich in flavonoids, and flavonoids have specifically been found to inhibit viral replication. So as an example, you're going to hear me talk about a supplement called quercetin. And quercetin is rich in onions and apples and nuts. And quercetin actually prevents the virus from attaching to that ACE receptor that's on the surface of our cells. So you want to make sure you're getting an abundance of different colors. All those different colors, which are used by the plant to protect the plant, are actually useful to us as well. Other things to include now are green tea. Green tea is rich in EGCG. There's not a condition that I haven't talked about health benefits of green tea in, from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, brain health. And it turns out green tea inhibits viral replication in a specific way, in a very specific way. Garlic. I shout out to a friend of mine who reminded me that garlic has long been understood as a natural anti-inflammatory, as an antiviral, as antibacterial. The best way to handle garlic is you crush it and let it air out for 10 minutes and then eat it. And for those of you who can't stomach raw garlic, add it very late in your cooking so that it retains much of its potency. Do not gain weight during this time. Do not gain weight. I was talking with a friend of mine who was one of my partners when I was a hospitalist years ago, who is still a hospitalist, who's seeing COVID patients now. And she said that all of her patients are obese, and they're underlying, one of the common things that they're seeing in their hospital is obesity as a big risk factor. Now, what do we exclude? This is not the time to drink. And it's interesting, my cousin has a dear friend who is head of IT of an alcohol distribution service in New York City, who has had to hire staff. They cannot keep up with the demand. This is not the time to drink. Alcohol does not augment immune function, it does quite the opposite. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we do not want to be eating sugar now. Sugar is very inflammatory, and this is going the exact opposite direction of what we want. And we want to eliminate processed foods, of course. They're too calorie dense and nutrient bereft. So while we all want to figure out ways to make the passage of this time much better, doing it through crap food is not the way to do it. I would love to have a conversation to find out how many of you all have adopted some form of meditation during this period of time. This is perhaps one of the most powerful strategies. If you've thought about it, again, this is the time to start meditating. Don't underestimate the power of the mind to incur healing. There are tons of studies that have been done on this. Meditation reduces inflammation. Meditation improves oxygenation and blood flow throughout the body. I can't say enough good things. And those of you who have heard me speak have heard me talk endlessly about it. Deep breathing. Why? Because we want to make sure that our lung tissue is strong. That includes the tissue that surrounds our rib cage, as well as our diaphragm. So some of the practices I've been hearing about include what I've listed here: 5 deep breaths, holding for 5 seconds each, release each time, and repeat. And on the 6th deep breath, you give a good cough as you exhale. And repeat this for 2 rounds. And then you can repeat this 3 to 5 times a day. The other important thing is laying on your belly, because the majority of your lung tissue is in the lower third of your lungs and in the posterior portion of your body. So it's not a good idea to be laying down with your belly facing up throughout the day, particularly if you've gotten infected. You want to be on your belly. And in fact, in the ICU, for the patients who are on ventilators, we rotate them so that there's good aeration throughout all the tissues of the lungs. Remember, we talked about innate immunity, that first branch that attacks bacteria and viruses. We want to do things that will augment that. And so we know that vitamin D3 does that. We know that the mushrooms do that. So when you're going shopping, in addition to the brightly colored fruits and vegetables, the green tea, the probiotic foods we talked about, you want to get shiitake mushrooms, portobello mushrooms, the more exotic, not as much the button mushrooms, but the more exotic mushrooms. And you can also take mushroom extracts and the fruiting bodies and fermented mushrooms to augment innate immunity. The other interesting thing is we know that hot and cold experiences can boost immune function. So taking hot showers and cold showers, or being out in the sun and taking a cold shower, using an infrared sauna. Now, admittedly, there's been no studies on the infrared sauna specifically with regards to COVID, but using heat as a treatment has been done for a very, very long time. In fact, they used to induce fevers in people to help kill off devastating diseases like syphilis. So I question taking down fevers. I really actually prefer my patients maintain a fever, or let's just say not take medication to inhibit fevers unless they're very uncomfortable. With kids, it's a different story, because children tend to be much more irritable and cranky with a fever. But as adults, if we can endure a fever, it's better to not lower it, in my mind, than it is to take medication to lower it. If you're very uncomfortable and it makes it difficult for you to sleep, then my bias is to actually lower a fever at bedtime. So now let's talk about what supplements can we take. This is where I feel like integrative and functional medicine can really play a strong role, not only in advocating for healthy lifestyle, but because a lot of the work that we do really focuses on what's the literature around supplements and herbs and nutrients to support immune function. Now, I want to preface this by saying there have been no studies specifically on COVID for most of these. We have extrapolated data from either influenza or SARS or MERS, all of which are RNA viruses, the SARS and MERS in particular. So Some of these supplements do have data insofar as they've been looked at with regards to SIRS and MERS, which are the two other coronavirus infectious epidemics that have existed. So there is data to support using these. In addition, the concern, the risk of taking these is so de minimis that I feel very comfortable making these recommendations. If you want to take a photograph of these slides, you can. They'll also be posted tomorrow so that you can go back and refer to this. So let's start with a good multivitamin. We know that many of us have micronutrient deficiencies. I know this because I test people's micronutrient levels frequently. And so it's good insurance now to be on a good multivitamin. Micronutrient deficiencies weaken immunity. Zinc is a very common micronutrient deficiency that we see, and this is not a time to have a zinc deficiency. So a good multivitamin, I like a 1 a day. I happen to use the company Pure Encapsulations for that because they have a lot of nutrients in a single dose of a vitamin. So very often multivitamins are like 6 pills a day, which when you're taking a lot of other supplements is very difficult to do. Another way to do it would be to get a powdered version of a multivitamin and put it in your smoothies. Vitamin D3, everyone should be on, in my opinion, 5,000 IUs a day. If you happen to know that your levels are 50 or greater, you could potentially back off, but I would like to see a minimum of a blood level of 50. We know that D3 is an important immune modulator. It dampens down too much inflammation. It pushes up necessary inflammation. And we know that people who take D3 regularly seem to have a reduced incidence of respiratory infections. Vitamin C, 1,000 milligrams a day. I think many of us are already doing that. Probiotics can be gotten from food. So if you're eating a probiotic-rich diet, you do not need to take additional probiotics necessarily. Elderberry, a very important herb, particularly in the setting of viral infections, has been long in use. We know that it inhibits viral replication. We know exactly how it does it. I'm in favor of taking 500 milligrams a day or 10 cc's of liquid elderberry daily. Other supplements, we prefer a zinc lozenge and ideally a zinc gluconate at about 15 milligrams a day, or you could take 2 15-milligram lozenges a day, so 1 lozenge twice a day. Zinc has a specific way in which it prevents the virus from replicating itself, and incidentally, chloroquine uses that mechanism to help prevent replication of the virus once it's inside our cells. Melatonin, you heard me mention. Melatonin, it actively reduces inflammation. It is a powerful antioxidant. It happens to be very active in the lungs. So I like to see everybody taking at least 1 milligram a day of melatonin. One word of caution, melatonin can produce very vivid dreams. For some people, that's wonderful. For others, it's not such a fun thing. So please pay attention to that. If that happens for you, you may want to decrease the dose. Quercetin, I had mentioned earlier, rich in apples and onions, 500 milligrams twice a day. As I mentioned, it prevents viral entry into the cell, and it also dampens down the cytokines that we see released by an overexuberant inflammatory response. So I would like for people to be incorporating quercetin daily. Curcumin is overall a very good anti-inflammatory, and resveratrol as well is a strong anti-inflammatory. So while it's a lot of supplements, many of them have very specific mechanism of action against viruses. So if you could get some of these in, it would be fantastic. If you can get all of these in, you get a gold star, and you know that you're doing what we know today can be very helpful in protecting you. So let's, as we come to an, I don't have too much more that I want to say, and then I want to open it up to questions. If you do get sick, I do want you to stay in very close contact with your doc or your nurse practitioner. I want you to stay extremely well hydrated. You know you're well hydrated when your urine is pale yellow to clear. Now, if you've taken a multivitamin, you're going to notice that your urine is bright yellow the first urine after that, but it should get clear as the day goes on. Remember to breathe and aerate your lungs. Keep them very strong. Sleep when you need to. Increase your sleep. Of course, we all know that. Move. Resist the urge to stay flat in bed. Increase your melatonin to at least 5 milligrams. Add in N-acetylcysteine, which is protective of the lung tissue, 600 milligrams 3 times a day. Increase your zinc and increase your vitamin C. I would like to see, I know that in New York City, they are using IV vitamin C at 30 grams for the ICU patients. I'd like to see us using vitamin C a little bit more aggressively because there is so little harm associated with it. Some people do develop loose stools, so that's something to pay attention to. What else can you do? Many of our patients have wanted, who have recovered, have wanted to donate blood. Excuse me, not the patients who have donated blood, the convalescing, the patients who have recovered want to donate plasma, excuse me. And they can do that through One Blood, which is a local blood bank here in Miami. Donation of blood, I wasn't sure where that's being done, but it's also being done through One Blood, and that goes directly to Jackson. Bear in mind that because everybody is staying home, there's a significant shortage of blood. So particularly the type O, the universal donors, there's a great need for all blood types, but the O type is most specifically needed. The way they're doing it is you make an appointment, so there's no one else there but you when you're donating blood, and they're using every precaution that they use throughout the hospital system. So please consider that. The other thing I'd like for you to consider is donating other monetary resources to the University of Miami through the uhealthemergencyrelief.com website, where they're making sure that all of our first responders have enough personal protective gear, where they're doing massive research. They launched in a very short amount of time county-wide research looking at drawing antibody levels on random folks throughout the county to try to get a handle on who has been exposed. They're testing every single firefighter in the county, and they are tracking every patient who has had a COVID testing. So all of us are getting involved in that, and your resources would be greatly appreciated. So I'm going to end on that note. And this is a mantra that is said in the loving kindness meditation that's well known throughout the world. I perhaps would change the order to may you be healthy, may you be safe, may you be happy, and may you live a life of ease. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
And of course, we're seeing a lot of people exercising, and when running and crossing next to someone else, they're not practicing social distancing rules, and people are wondering whether or not, sweat or can you get sick that way?
So that's a good question. I mean, remember what I said, your first barrier to infection of any kind is your skin, and it does an awesome job. And I know of no transmission of this particular virus through skin. There are other viruses. We know that herpes viruses can get in through skin. However, that's through a break in the skin. That isn't through intact skin. So if you happen past somebody and sweat, sort of comes off on you, I have no concern that there's transmission of infection that way. Now, if you rub the area and then rub your eye, that's a different story. So remember the T-zone, which is your eyes and through here. This is where you have to become more mindful and not be touching that area. That is the T-zone where we are most vulnerable. But when it comes to running and running past someone who's breathing, I don't think that that's a significant enough exposure. We may learn otherwise, but I think it's more likely that a more direct exposure, if they were coughing and you happen to run by and rubbed your eye or breathed it in right at that moment, that might be more of a concern. That's why the distancing is important.
The question is, if you have to pick 4 vitamins or supplements, what would they be to really boost your immunity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if I had to pick which 4 I think the data is strongest for, or let's just say which 4 I try to make sure I get into my kids every day, I would say vitamin C, vitamin D, I would probably say quercetin. And right now, probably elderberry, because it's so specific. It's a tough question because honestly, a lot of these things are sold out or, they're coming back online. I would say any of the combination of things that you can get is a good idea for protecting yourself. And I want you to know that when you're taking these things, that you are doing yourself a huge service. So I don't think there's a perfect recipe for this. I would say that pragmatically, whatever you can get right now, but those are probably 4 of the ones that we're more consistent with.
We also have another question here. Is it a good idea for an immunocompromised 80-year-old to go for walks, or is it better for her inside?
No, I actually want everyone to go for a walk. I would encourage you to wear a mask. I would definitely encourage you to wear a mask while you're walking. I would be sure that you do not touch your face at all. And when you get home, of course, you wash your hands. I am not as worried about clothes, by the way. A lot of people are worried about clothes. The virus desiccates or dries out rather quickly because of the nature, the particles, especially if they're droplets, sort of land on clothing and then get desiccated or dried out more quickly than on other surfaces. So I'm less worried about clothes.
Dr. Koffler, I think that's it for today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for listening. I do hope that you remain well and sane through this difficult time.